I personally don't feel those kind of spiritual yearnings. It's I mean, it's not to say that I don't get a kind of sense of awe when I look out at the stars at night and so on and so forth. I get all that, but I don't necessarily think of that as being a spiritual experience.
Chris, let's explore your illuminating new book, The Science of Weird Shit, Why Our Minds Conjure the Paranormal. But first, let me give a brief bio. Chris French is Emeritus Professor and head of the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit in the Psychology Department at Goldsmiths, University of London, a unit he founded. He is a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. He is the co-author of Anomalistic Psychology Exploring Paranormal Belief and Experience. So, Chris, let's get a feel for the arc of the book by just getting some highlights from each of the chapters. The first chapter you called Weird Science, and you talk about the prevalence of belief. What is that in terms of populations by country or by some kind of demographic?
Well, there is obviously, as you'd expect, there is variation from country to country, and there's variation across time as well. But you will typically find a large proportion of the population that will endorse various paranormal beliefs. There's more survey data available from the US and from the UK than from a lot of other countries. But what we typically find there is that if you have a kind of standard array of paranormal phenomena, the majority of the population will endorse at least one of those. And so about half the population report that they kind of believe in life after death. About a third of the population believe in psychokinesis, the alleged ability to influence the outside world by thought alone. Similar kinds of figures for telepathy. And again, the kind of whole range, there's not much difference between the US and the UK. You do find kind of more, it depends on how you're going to define the paranormal, of course, but you'll find that there's more belief in kind of things like the literal existence of demons in America, no doubt because of the influence of Christian fundamentalism. There's much greater there, obviously, than over here.
Not to mention the political system.
I couldn't possibly.
That's a joke. That's a joke.
Yeah. Interestingly, again, no surprise, Republicans are much more likely to believe in the reality, the literal reality of Satan and demons than are Democrats. But again, that's interesting in itself, the way these things reflect different belief systems.
Yeah, and you find a high correlation between, for example, belief in life after death, which is related to the Christian belief system, and belief in the paranormal. Are there very high cross correlation between them, or?
It's interesting. There are correlations. There are a couple of interesting ideas. When you think about this, you could potentially argue it either way. On the one hand, you might say, well, because a lot of religions, which are obviously clearly of central importance to many people, already say that life after death is a reality, that people who are religious may well be more likely to say they also believe in paranormal phenomena that relate to life after death.
Yeah, sure.
On the other hand, another argument that was put forward was what was referred to as the spiritual void hypothesis. This is the idea that we all have a need for certain spiritual beliefs, and if traditional religions aren't satisfying those needs, we might turn to New Age ideas and paranormal. And so in one case, you'd expect a positive correlation. In the other case, you'd expect a negative correlation. If you actually look at the data, it's complicated. It depends on the particular religion, the particular context, and so on and so forth. Some religions explicitly condemn any kind of belief in the paranormal kind of outside their own religious belief system. So there's all kinds of factors that come into play.
Yeah, but what is clear is that there is a high ubiquity of the importance of some kind of paranormal, as you've described it in the broadest terms, whether it's religious or parapsychological or new agey stuff. There is a deep hunger in the human psyche for some sort of meaning beyond the self.
There does seem to be. There does seem to be. I mean, I think the kind of. I mean, I personally don't feel those kind of spiritual yearnings. It's. I mean, it's not to say that I don't get a kind of sense of awe when I look out at the stars at night and so on and so forth. I get all that, but I don't necessarily think of that as being a spiritual experience. So, I mean, there are kind of atheists and materialists who maybe don't feel that they've got that need, but they very much seem to be in a kind of minority. Most people, one way or another, as you are saying, have some kind of spiritual beliefs, whether it be religious or new age ideas or whatever else it may be.
In the chapter, you talk about how anomalistic psychology gets insights from psychological sub-disciplines. Give me some sense of that in terms of your analytical process. What ideas do you call upon from other areas of psychology that you can apply to anomalistic psychology?
Well, it's essentially, I mean, each of the different subdisciplines of psychology have kind of got something to offer in terms of potential explanations for the kinds of phenomena that we're interested in. So if you think of developmental psychology, for example, how do these kind of beliefs and ideas develop across childhood and into adulthood? I mean, we tell our kids all kinds of things about, uh, a big fat guy in a red suit who comes down the chimney at Christmas time and brings them toys, and this time of the year, the Easter Bunny, and all this kind of stuff. So we we actually deceive our children into believing all this magical stuff, and it's really interesting to look at how kids develop in terms of at a very early age, they're quite likely to believe in the literal reality of magic, but then they'll become more skeptical. At what point do they decide that actually Santa doesn't exist, and so on and so forth? So that's kind of one element. That's one example. But we can look at neuropsychology. We can look at how that might explain things like out of body experiences or near death experiences or sleep paralysis, a whole range of phenomena.
Temporal lobe epilepsies,
Yeah,
or
absolutely. All of that stuff is relevant. We can turn to, basically pretty much any side of psychology. Cognitive psychology, we can look at all the cognitive biases that we all suffer from and how are they relevant to explaining why we might misperceive certain situations and so on. I mean, the list goes on. In fact, the previous book that I co-authored with Anna Stone that you kindly referred to, we took the approach there of actually just looking at each of the different sub-disciplines of psychology and saying, what can this tell us? And we have chapters on evolutionary psychology, on social psychology, the whole range.
so chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5 deal with different kinds of anecdotes, stories. Everyone has some story, but chapter 2 is on nightmares, 3 is on encounter with ghosts, 4 is communicating with the dead, 5 is memories of alien encounters. These stories are rich, they're interesting, they're certainly although no doubt there are huge numbers of hoaxes and delusions, but they are certainly to a large degree believed by the people who have had them. And you give some very poignant and powerful examples. Pick one or two examples that really were profound in your exploration of this whole paranormal area.
Well, one of the topics that absolutely fascinates me, and there's quite a long chapter in the book about this, is sleep paralysis, which is this in its most basic form. It is pretty much precisely what it says on the tin. It's a temporary period of paralysis that occurs between sleep and wakefulness, and sometimes that's all it is. And if you experience that, it's a bit disconcerting, but it's no big deal. But it can be associated with other symptoms that can make it absolutely terrifying. They include things like a very strong sense of presence. There's something in the room with you. It's occurring while you're in bed. It's in the dark. You can't move, and you've got this sense that there's some kind of evil presence in there with you. But you might actually hallucinate. You might see monstrous figures. You might see lights moving around the room or dark shadows. You might hear voices or footsteps. You get pressure on the chest and difficulty breathing. You feel there's something trying to strangle you. And I get sent lots of first-hand accounts of sleep paralysis because people know I'm interested in it. And this is coming from people who've already decided that it was a hallucinatory experience. That's why they're sending their accounts to me rather than to the priest or the psychiatrist, you know. And yet still reading them, they are so creepy that you can. I mean, the thing is, the important point is, while it's happening, it feels real. It feels incredibly real, and these are real experiences that people have, and often kind of don't know what to make of them. So I kind of, part of the reason I want to get the word out there about sleep paralysis is to reassure people that yes, it's incredibly scary, but it's not real.
Sleep paralysis, I completely understand from that perspective, but some of the others, encounters with ghosts or communicating with the dead, have any of these stories, and you've been a collector, I would assume, of hundreds of real firsthand accounts, have any of them made you think twice and rattle your skepticism, or not a one?
It's not something that is likely to happen on the basis of that anecdotal evidence, because I am aware as a psychologist of how unreliable memory can be. I'm aware of the existence of false memories. I'm aware of all the ways in which we can misperceive things, we can misinterpret things, and so on. So anecdotal evidence like that is never going to be enough on its own to convince me. And even if it was me that was having those experiences, I shouldn't kind of think, oh, well, that proves it's true then. I'm just as prone to those kind of biases as anybody else, you know?
I'm,
Uh,
I'm with you on that. People write into Closer to Truth and say I should take psychedelics and see the reality of the world. And my answer to that is I haven't and I don't. My answer is that if I did and I saw that, I wouldn't believe it. I wouldn't believe any experience, emotional, spiritual experience that I would have would be enough to convince me that it were the case.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you on that one. But it's interesting that when people have those kinds of experiences, they can get that subjective sense of absolute certainty. There's nothing that could shake them from the belief at that point. I mean, and skeptics often get accused of being closed-minded. Well, for me, being closed-minded is not being able to answer the question, "What would convince you that you're wrong?" Yeah,
Hmm.
now say something like telepathy. I can tell you, what kind of data would convince me that telepathy really does exist. Whereas somebody who's just absolutely certain on the basis of their own experience, you can say, what would convince you that you're wrong? And there's nothing. They know they're right.
Chapter 6, as you call Many Happy Returns, great title, and it's a chapter about reincarnation, past lives. Rough percentage of people who believe in reincarnation or past lives,
Well, that would depend which country you took the data from.
right?
Because, I mean, although surprisingly, even in the UK and probably the US, I think would be similar. It's about 25%, which is it's just a very high number when you think about it. In other countries, of course, it can be virtually the whole population. And there are religions where reincarnation is a really important part of the religion, and therefore pretty much everybody would believe in it.
Yeah. There's a reincarnation and past lives deal. They sound like they're the same thing, but they're not quite. Reincarnation has a connotation of within a religious belief system of karma and sort of a naturalistic process of of fundamental reality, how it works in schools of Hinduism and schools of Buddhism, not all in each, of course. And in past lives in the West, it has its different connotation. It's sort of sounds the same, but they're really quite different.
Yeah, I mean, there's in the book I divide them into two. I divide past life memories into two different general types. There's the one that is based on hypnotic regression,
Uh-huh.
and I think the evidence there, certainly to me, is very compelling that what we're dealing with there are false memories. There's all kinds of reasons for my saying that. One is that typically, if someone is hypnotically regressed back into a past life, the version of the life that they describe is the Hollywood version. It's not the historically accurate version.
Mm.
it's based on films they've seen, etc., etc.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of other evidence as well, which
Yeah. Have you looked at the so-called database of past lives from the Division of Perceptual Studies, University of Virginia, that Ian Stevenson started, Bruce Grayson, and others have perpetuated?
I've not looked at that in any depth, I'll confess. And my own experience of kind of doing any of that kind of research is limited. I'll acknowledge that. I took part in a documentary back in the late 90s where we went to Lebanon to investigate reincarnation claims amongst the Druze. And to be honest, I didn't really know what to expect. But I came back from that experience pretty much convinced that the cases that we looked at were almost certainly based on false memories. Now, there are other cases which I think would be much harder to explain in psychological terms. So, as I say, there are only a limited number of hours in a day, and no, I have not looked in any depth into
Yeah,
those cases.
I've been encouraged to look at that as well, and I have not taken the time to do it yet either. One fascinating argument among the sci folks that I've enjoyed is the argument against talking to the dead or past lives, against it from what's called super psi. And super psi is the sense that people who claim to have a past life, or people who talk to the dead, are actually getting data in a clairvoyant
Mhm.
sense, or something from a real paranormal or real psi experience, but it's not a past life and it's not talking to the dead. And some would argue that it's impossible logically to distinguish among the two. And this is an intra psi believer community. And I find that argument a very interesting one.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is an interesting argument, and but as you say, there'd be the conceptual difficulty of being able to tease those two possibilities apart. I mean, in the same way that when you actually stop and think it through, it's pretty much impossible to separate telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition from each other.
Right.
And J.B. Ryan, I think, preferred the term general ESP just to try and get around that problem. But yeah, it's. I mean,
Right.
as I say, I'm not convinced that there is anything paranormal going on in those cases. Could be wrong. Um, so, I'm not going to try and worry too much about whether it might be this version or that version until I'm convinced that there really is something there to be explained.
Chapter 7, Dying to Know the Truth, you deal with near-death experiences, NDAs. And I have to tell you that over the years, the most criticism that Closer to Truth has gotten has been from people who say we have not explored NDEs in our ontological search for existence and sentience and all the work we've done. And we give a lot of credence to philosophers of religion who believe in the non-physical and God. We deal with a lot of non-physical theories and consciousness, but I've not had the strong motivation to include explorations of NDEs in the ontological search. It's certainly a real phenomenon and can be investigated. And so, from your perspective of the range of explanations for near-death experiences, which are the ones you favor?
Well, you probably won't be too surprised to. Basically, I would tend to prefer the neuropsychological explanations. They certainly need to be fleshed out in more detail. One of the reasons that I tend to favour those kind of explanations is that every single component of the near-death experience sometimes occurs outside of the context of a near-death experience. And it's often easier to study them outside that context because obviously, by definition, near-death experiences tend to occur at unpredictable times, and you've not got the equipment and the facilities to be able to study them, except in very rare circumstances. So, for example, if we wanted to study the out-of-body experience, there are certain people who claim that they can induce an out-of-body experience more or less at will just by engaging in various mental exercises, Well, that's a much easier hypothesis to test. There's no reason to believe that their out of body experiences are different from the ones of a near death experience.
Right,
We sit
right.
someone down in this chair where I'm sitting now. We get them to have an out of body experience and tell me what's in the room, on the table in the room opposite. And that's it. That would prove it. The skeptics would be defeated. And yet, despite claims for decades and decades, nobody's ever been able to do that. And so, similarly with the kind of other components of the near death experience, they're often easier to study outside of the context of a near death experience. And it's going to take some kind of synthesis of putting all those bits and pieces together, like people like Sue Blackmore have attempted to do. But we at least are coming up with testable hypotheses there. And that's appealing to me.
Chapter 8 deals with coincidences. I think everyone has had coincidences. In my early life, I was fascinated by Carl Jung's synchronicity as indicating a kind of non-causal correlations, indicating some deep realities beyond our ken. And I think Sue, 25 years ago when I first met her, made the point that the key to understand coincidences is to understand the coincidences that did not occur.
Exactly. Yeah.
And if you have one that seems to be one chance in a quadrillion, if you think about all the coincidences that could have happened that didn't, there's almost an infinite amount. Yeah. I think she used the example that if you have a dream and then that your father died and your father dies within a period of time, she said in the UK there are 50 million people, and how many deaths, and you can calculate some kind of thing. But if it happens to you, it's the one example. The analogy I like is if you say you hit a golf ball and it lands on a particular strand of grass, well, what's the odds of that happening? It's 1 in 100 million, however many there are strands of grass, but it had to land on some strand of grass.
Yeah. No, that's it. No, I mean every moment of every day we're kind of swimming in a sea of potential coincidences, and most of them we won't even notice. We won't even notice that they're there, but occasionally we will, and it is a very kind of it attracts our attention. It makes sense that it would do in terms of evolutionary psychology, because sometimes it will actually be meaningful. Sometimes it's not just a coincidence. There's some kind of explanation behind it. But sometimes it will be just a coincidence. And people find it very, very difficult to think in terms of things just being a coincidence. So things like precognitive dreams or telephone telepathy, where people think they know who's phoning them before they actually pick up the phone, and so on. Coincidence goes a long way to explaining those kinds of phenomena.
Did you have a most difficult to explain coincidence?
I don't personally, but what's really interesting is that somebody, another psychologist in this area, a guy called David Marks, who wrote classic books about debunking Uri Geller and various other skeptical works over the years, including writing about the psychology of coincidence. He recently came out with, and I would have classified him as being an extreme skeptic, but his most recent book on the psychology of the paranormal, he seems to have changed his position quite dramatically on the basis of what he sees as being a series of coincidences that happened to him personally, and the impact was such that he's now kind of, I think, changed his position quite considerably. He's still not at all impressed by the data coming out from controlled laboratory studies of telepathy and psychokinesis and so on, but he's arguing that maybe it sometimes occurs spontaneously in everyday life, but it will never be captured in the laboratory. And that's quite a turnabout for somebody who was such an extreme skeptic.
That tracks a little bit of my own thinking. I've thought along similar lines. In Chapter 9, Tricks of the Mind, you have a term, just briefly explained, transliminality.
That was an idea that was put forward by a parapsychologist called Michael Falborn. He is no longer with us, sadly, but he was putting it forward as a possible explanation for ESP, because he is a believer, or was a believer, I should say. And the basic idea is that if you think of the mind as having some parts of non-conscious, some parts of conscious, and you have a kind of, you can conceive it as being a kind of semi-permeable membrane between them, and sometimes the non-conscious stuff passes through into conscious awareness, and that this membrane varies in terms of its permeability. So he was putting it forward as an explanation that ESP might have its roots in non-conscious processes that in some people do actually make it through into consciousness. I thought it was an interesting idea from a skeptical perspective, the idea that we might sometimes pick up on information in our environment without being consciously aware of it. And then when we make decisions on the basis of that information that we weren't consciously aware of, we might think, well, I must be psychic then. I've no other explanation, you know. And we carried out some experimental work that offered some support for that.
Chapters 10 and 11, you have great stories about dreams of the future and the skeptical inquiries. I'd like to focus just a little bit on chapter 12, which turns us around a little bit and asks, can we learn lessons for the living? Where you say anomalistic psychology can be a painless way of learning important critical thinking skills. How so?
Well, again, I think for most people, the kind of evidence that they would find most convincing is their own personal experience. And that's a very human, very natural position to take. As a psychologist, I would say it's not the correct position to take, because we're all prone to these kind of biases, hallucinatory experiences, failures of memory, etc., that I talk about throughout the book. You know, sometimes you'll hear skeptics saying, you know, I've never seen a ghost, so I don't believe in them. Well, you know, even if I thought I'd seen a ghost, I don't think you should believe in them. And it's really important, I think, to a lot of the time, say the critical thinking is not about telling people what to think, but maybe trying to help them in terms of how to think, how to evaluate evidence. And part of that is being aware of the biases that we all suffer from. We've got reasoning biases. We've got biases of interpretation. We're all very poor at understanding probabilities and so on and so forth. And all these kind of different factors come into play. Now, knowing about them doesn't give you 100% protection from them, but I think it may help. And so, you know, that is a kind of an important lesson for me from anomalistic psychology. Try to make you be aware of the fact that you've got these imperfections in the cognitive system. We all have them.
I really like the epilogue, the limits of skepticism. You referred to that a little bit before, but you give some opposite views and then your own kind of nuanced view. Why did you end with that chapter or that epilogue?
To be quite honest with you, that epilogue wasn't there in the original draft of my manuscript, which was sent out to 4 reviewers, and they all said very nice things about it, for which I'm eternally grateful. But one of them did say, might be interesting to include something about the limits of skepticism, and my editor liked that idea, and I kind of thought, yeah, it is quite a nice idea, but I then had to write another chapter. And I basically, what I did in that section was to kind of pose the question, well, what would it take to turn me back into a believer? You know, what kind of experience or data or evidence what would it take? And just kind of basically, I use the epilogue to explore that idea.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and comment below. You can support Closer to Truth by subscribing. Closer to Truth is now accepting your tax-exempt donations. Please come to closertotruth.com/donate. Thank you very much for supporting us, and thanks for watching.